Welcome, everyone, to C4SS's The Long Library, Episode 2, where we dive into the works and writings of philosopher and anarchist and writer Roderick Long. Thanks for joining us in our second episode, Roderick.
Oh, good to be here.
This week, or month, I should say, we're exploring corporations versus the market, or with Conflation Now. I think this is a piece many of our listeners will probably be familiar with. And so I thought it was kind of a good place to come in and for our second episode. Last week, for our viewers and listeners who didn't see, we did your responses and objections to market anarchism. And so this week, I thought we could get into kind of the left libertarian stuff and the C4SS sense. And this is a popular piece in that regard. It was also included in Markets, Not Capitalism after it was initially published in Cato Unbound. And it's also one I share a lot still from C4SS social media and is just a pretty good introduction to a lot of left libertarian ideas. So, as usual, I want to ask of you about the origin of the piece, kind of what led to it coming about, if you had any sort of thing you wanted to accomplish by writing it, what was the context of all that?
Okay, well, Cato Unbound is this project Cato Institute does of, picking some topic and then bringing, several writers with different perspectives, some libertarian, some not, but the libertarians often have different flavors, to talk about some topic. And so usually they'll have like three lead essays by the three lead participants, but sometimes there are additional participants as well. And so this was from November 2008 was this one, and you can find it if you look on the
it's still online on Cato and it's on C4SS's website.
Pardon?
Well, it is still available on the website on Cato Unbound, and it's also republished on C4SS since and included in Markets Not Capitalism.
And Markets Not Capitalism, or I guess as we should call it nowadays, Markets No Cap.
Yeah, that's what I call it, though, my friends.
So I was just presenting the.
Did they reach out to you to did they wanted to do a Cato Unbound on big business, on left libertarianism, on
the official title of that exchange was "When Corporations Hate Markets," and the other participants were the other libertarian, the late lamented Steve Horowitz, and then the two not so libertarian contributors were Matthew Iglesias and Dean Baker. But some other people got involved as well, and other people around the web were commenting on it too. And so so if you look at the whole thing on Cato Unbound, you'll also see my replies to everyone from Walter Block to Peter Klein and so on. But this was the essay that this was the lead essay. This is the one that kicked it off, and everyone else was responding to that. And so, there's not a lot in it that's original. Maybe a couple of things are, but it's mostly just sort of presenting I guess, several things I wanted to do. And at first, I just wanted to present the idea that it's a mistake to think of free market policies as promoting corporate power, economic centralization, and so forth. That in fact, those are the more likely to be the result of government intervention in the economy that artificially rigs things in the favor of the corporate elite and benefits them and helps to create or prop them up. And so that basic idea, which I think is something that many people on both the left and the right miss, including libertarians on the right, because people on the left often treat the defects and unattractive features of sort of corporate plutocracy as a reason to oppose the free market. And people on the right often, including right libertarians, often treat the advantages and uh, and attractions of a free market as a reason to serve as apologists for features that we would regard as sort of corporate plutocracy, things that are not the result of the market. So that's one thing I'm going to do and a lot of what I'm doing there is just sort of pointing to or summarizing existing research. Also, I wanted to say something about how this dynamic works, which is that it's not just that people are confused about this, but their confusion about the system actually reinforces the system, which is not the case with all confusions. I mean, if people are confused about astronomy, or people are confused about, I don't know, the various confusions that don't reinforce the confusion, but the thing they're confused about. But this one does, in that people who are, people who are horrified by the the corporate power, the centralized hierarchical workplaces, the massive economic inequality, and so forth, and who see that as the result of free markets, will tend to be opposing free markets for that reason. And people, on the other hand, who see these things through the lens of, well, these are the results of a free market, and free market is the best system you can have, and so we have to defend these things, will end up defending the existing system. And so, given that, it's very hard to find your way out of supporting the existing regime, because either you are, if you like free markets, then you end up supporting the results of what are actually not free markets and carrying water for that. And if you don't like them, then you end up supporting the power of the state, which is in fact what tends to cause this problem. And so that was another thing that I wanted to do in the article.
I'm really curious about the like what specifically did they say when they prompted you? Were they like, oh, we know that you think big business and the market are enemies, so launch this whole discussion for us. My cat likes this question. And when in the process did you know who the other writers in the series would be as well? I'm curious about both of those, like the prompt and when you found that, like the other writers.
It's a long time ago, and long enough ago that both my memory and my electronic substitute for memory are can't really provide the answer to that. So I forget, I forget who asked me. Anyway, so that's
well, it was your birthday just a few days ago. And you turned, well, I think 30?
60.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, depends on what base you're using.
Yeah.
But yes, no, I am an aged man now, and I can't be expected to remember stuff that happened way back in 2008.
Tell us, and this. Oh, go ahead.
Anyway, so I don't remember when I don't remember who asked me, and I don't remember when I knew who the other people were going to be. But Cato has and has had, because the personnel changes, but they've had a variety of people with there have been people there with more sympathy toward left libertarianism than you might think, simply from the the major stuff that comes out. That's true of a lot of libertarian organizations. Is that
it is?
In fact, it's just as there are a lot more libertarian friendly people in conservative think tanks than you might think. So there are a lot of more left libertarian friendly people in libertarian think tanks.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that. One way I've kind of seen that anecdotally is from tabling for C4SS at events like LibertyCon, Students for Liberty's annual event, and stuff like that. And Cato has such a big presence at those places, and you consistently will get Cato people to come up to the C4SS table and get some stickers, some zines, express a lot of support, which is always very fun. On the topic of Well, can you tell us the title, how the title came about and the reference to the title? Because also our younger viewers will appreciate that, I think,
Yeah.
knowledge.
So I mean, the title is Corporations versus the Market, but there's a subtitle, Whip Conflation Now, which is a reference that people my age will get and people younger may not. So back in the 70s, Gerald Ford's administration came up with this anti-inflation campaign called Whip Inflation Now, WIN, win. And the idea behind it was to promote disciplined spending habits among the population and saving and so forth. And there were even forms you could send in where you would. I think the idea was inspired by sort of the V for Victory campaign in World War II. It's like, this is a fight is for declared inflation, enemy number one, and so we were supposed to have the kind of war on inflation that we'd had the war on the Axis powers during the 40s. It's not, doesn't make as good a subject for movies, really. But of course, from a free market perspective, the the cause of inflation, this organization was trying to get the population excited about fighting inflation, was in fact the cause of inflation. And the cause of inflation was not people, ordinary people failing to rein in their spending habits. But anyway, you could say there were forms you could fill out saying, yes, I want to be part of the fight against inflation, and you would send this form to the White House, and they would send you a button or a sticker or some kind of inflation fighting swag with the Whip Inflation Now
Did you
logo
do
on.
that? Did you get the button?
I did not do that.
I
Um,
thought you were against inflation.
um, well, back in 1974, I was, which I think is when this was, I was 10 years old, and my,
So you were pro-inflation at that point
I
in
was,
your
yeah,
ideological journey?
I was pro inflation. To the extent that,
You were a dumb 10-year-old.
I had any, I had no political interests of any kind. I mean, our family was sort of broadly speaking, uh, you know, sort of Goldwater Republican type stuff, with all the good and bad things that implies. Um,
So
but
they were lovers of Karl Hess, is what you're saying,
um,
in a way.
actually, well, my mother told me how conflicted she felt one time when she went to this. There were these two groups tabling at some place, and one of them was like people from the Air Force. These young people all dressed up in their spiffy uniforms, looking young and clean and heroic, and they were tabling for the benefits of the Air Force. And over the other table there was these hippies who were protesting the war. And my mother felt torn between them because she admired the you know the image of the Air Force guys, but she didn't like the war stuff, and and she didn't like the grunginess of the hippies, but their opposition to the war she found much more tempting. So I mean, eventually she stopped being conflicted in that, and became you know got on the right side of those issues. But yeah, I remember her telling me that would have been when I was, the war would have been the Vietnam War, and I would have been, I don't know, even younger than
Well,
during the.
clearly, anti-war protesters should dress as naval officers to aesthetically appeal to a wider audience.
Um, I seem to recall that the Weather Underground actually had planned to do that as part of one of their bombing campaigns. But
How would you know that if you weren't part of the Weather Underground? Are you admitting to that right now?
I've said too much.
Before we get into the content of your article, well, I'm curious if you just had any thoughts on the ensuing discussion, like you said, I mean, that's the structure of Cato Unbound. And for anyone who doesn't know, Cato Unbound was a huge inspiration for C4SS's mutual exchange symposiums as well. A little different sometimes depending on which, but those I've always enjoyed those discussions, and there's many more. Some others with you, others with not. We'll probably get to other essays of yours in those discussions later on, I bet. So what did you think of the discussion in this one, which, like you said, stuck with in the Cato Unbound discussion, and also went out of that and brought in other blogs and people. There was a lot going on with that.
Well, so yeah, I mean, it was very useful. Yeah, I don't think that anyone's views were particularly budged, but I mean, all four of us, the main ones, because there were four main ones, as I mentioned, all agreed that there are sort of pro corporate policies that get marketed as free market and are not, and that's bad. So we all agreed on that much. Steve Horowitz thought that I was understating. I was understating the extent to which corporations actually get their success through genuine entrepreneurship and not just through government favoritism. And I was understating the, so he was sort of broadly agreeing with me, but it took like a more moderate version of the view. Matthew Iglesias mainly thought his disagreement was mainly over the solution. He thought that he thought that the solution was to get the government to take vigorous action to restrain the power of corporations, and so he wanted more intervention in the economy, not less. Dean Baker was sort of like a one note activist. He's very skeptical of copyright and patents, which I agree with him on. But he and I would agree that that copyrights and patents are one of the ways in which not just that considered in themselves they're morally questionable, but they are one of the ways in which large corporations, their power is in fact centralized by government intervention. But his solution was to to have less in the way of intellectual property. I don't think he wanted to abolish it completely, but he wanted to fairly radically rein it in, but to replace it with the government giving out grants to encourage various kinds of invention and creation and so forth. And I thought that would not be an obvious improvement. It would be usual public choice problems of massive rent seeking and inefficiency of government subsidies. Then among the people who commented,
you said Block and Klein. I remember there.
Yeah. So Peter Klein said, "Look, there are subsidies to big business, sure, and that is bad, yes. And in fact, he's shown that badness in a lot of his own work. But he says, look, there are subsidies to small businesses as well, and also he thought that although I didn't stress this part in my contribution to the debate, but I did mention my preference for not just my preference for, but my expectation that we would see firms that were less hierarchical, that had greater worker participation in the control of them, and he thought that those were inefficient and bedeviled by various kinds of incentive problems, and thought that that I was being driven by some kind of an aesthetic aversion to hierarchical firms. And what I was saying was, well, it's true that there are small firms that do receive government aid, But I'd say those are the ones that, to borrow the line from Bastiat, those are the ones that you see. The small firms you don't see are the ones that prevented coming into existence, were the ones who wouldn't get subsidies in the first place, the ones that would just be, it was some local person with very low level of capital, just like starting a taxi service where all you need is, your cell phone and a car or something like that, or starting starting a little restaurant in your home, or a little store in your home, which are ruled out by all kinds of zoning regulations and so on. And uh, and Also, I'm always puzzled. I get this a lot from right libertarians, or libertarians who are farther right than I am. Will often think that the aversion to hierarchy and in firms is an aesthetic one, as opposed to an ethical one. Maybe if they call it aesthetic, it's easier for them to dismiss it as well. I just
Yeah.
I like vanilla flavored firms, and they like raspberry flavored firms or something. But it is the worry about hierarchical firms is that they are they're pushing people around. They're not necessarily doing it in ways that violate rights. So I think their ability to do it is based on a background of rights violations. But it's objectionable for some of the same reasons that rights violations are objectionable. And so Peter had he had this sort of this nightmare vision of these workers co-ops where people spend all their time in endless meetings and debates and so on, and that are inefficient. And I said well, look, if you had genuine competition, the workers co-ops that did that would have to compete with workers co-ops that did not do that. And how competition works. Walter Block's objection, which he co-authored with Jacob Hubert, who actually became sort of less opposed to. I don't think he ever became a left libertarian, but in some of his later writings, he was less opposed to the kinds of arguments I'm making than he was at the time. But they seem to think that I was embracing the left-wing progressive state and its policies, which was strange. Also, they were horrified by my saying that we need stronger unions, because they had a fairly typical right libertarian aversion to unions. And I had a link to an article by Charles Johnson, which they clicked on and in some sense read the article, but they said, well, Charles wants to keep existing labor law, but have more militant unions, and by militant he must mean violent. And it's pretty clear that Charles does not want to keep existing labor law from that article. So I think they read it through the lens of what they when you have a certain vision of what the landscape is, of what the various options are, then you tend to interpret positions as fitting into one of your preconceived categories, even when they don't. And so I think that's part of what was going on there with them. I mean, there was more that they said, but those are some of the ones that I recall.
Let's dive into the basic argument of the piece. So, why do you argue corporations hate markets?
Okay, well, of course, corporations. I mean, it's not necessarily corporations as such that hate markets. I mean, if the Molinari Institute is a corporation, it's a nonprofit corporation, but Although there are interesting questions to ask about the legitimacy of the corporate form. I don't think that itself is necessarily leads people to be anti-market, but it's that when people are worried about corporations, they're worried about large, powerful corporations, and people on the left tend to think, if they're not, the non-libertarian left, well, depending on how you
There's no
define
such thing.
but they tend to think that is the result of the free market. They think that bigger that you succeed by outcompeting other firms, and by outcompeting them, you get bigger, you acquire more market share, which puts you in a position to outcompete others even more. So there's a tendency for more and more centralization of economic power under free market. That's the standard left wing view. Whereas the left wing of the left libertarian view, or the free market anti-capitalist view, is that competition is an equalizing force, a leveling force. That if you're allowed, if someone is successful in the market, others can imitate them, and so if they try to reap disproportionate benefits from their successes, by charging a lot, they will attract more competitors into the market, and so therefore, as a general rule, you should expect, if you see, some ongoing systematic, massive inequality with some firm that really has a very large market share and is really exploiting that. If you see that happen, then you should suspect, it may not be the case in every possible instance, but you should suspect that there's some kind of government intervention that's making it harder for people to compete with them. And lo and behold, if you look for it, you generally find it. So it's not just we're declaring a priori this must be the case, but you look and you see it. Copyrights and patents are actually a good one of the most clear examples of forbidding imitation. You do something that's very successful, other people want to imitate it, and copyrights and patents quite specifically prohibit people from imitating the thing you did to make success, and thus making more successful. Also, and this is an argument that Kevin Carson has particularly been pushing for a long time, is people often say that the reason to expect large dominant firms in a market economy is economies of scale. So the basic idea of economies of scale is that often it's easier for one large firm it's cheaper for one large firm to do things than for two smaller firms to do them. So here's an example. Suppose that you and I each have a firm, and we do photocopying in our firm, as one often does. And your firm has two copy machines, one for regular use and one as a backup. And I've got two copy machines, one for regular use and one for a backup. So that's four that are being used. But if we were to combine into one bigger firm, we probably wouldn't need two copy machines plus two backups. We could have two copy machines and one backup, because you don't use the backup that much, hopefully. And so by consolidating into one firm, we would actually lower our overall costs, and lots of duplication that goes on. It's cheaper to have. It's often cheaper to have one large office than two smaller ones, or whatever. All these things favor combining smaller firms into larger ones, and if the ones don't, and so the larger firms that do this will be more efficient with their lower costs, and they'll either drive the smaller ones out of business or gobble them up or whatever. H.G. Wells was such a fan of this idea that he really thought it's hard to know whether to call him an ultra socialist or an ultra capitalist, because he really thought there should be one big firm for all of society, because specifically because of economies of scale. In fact, this novel that Wells wrote that about this drug that creates giant chickens and giant rats and so forth. A novel, the Food of the Gods. It might not be obvious reading it, first level until you get sort of toward the end of the book, but really the giant rats and giant chickens are just sort of a fun adventure toward the beginning of the book. But the end of the book is really about how once you get sort of the larger humans, it's really about how larger scale, the larger scale is the wave of the future. But as Kevin Carson points out, yes, there are economies of scale, but there are also diseconomies of scale, and you can draw for this on the critique of central planning that you get from economists like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, who, as my Austrian friends will remind us, did not give precisely the same argument, but they both focus on the fact that there are informational and calculational perversities you get with centralized planning when you reduce the feedback from the market, so that the more things that the more functions that a firm moves inside, the harder it is. So the purpose of market feedback is it tells you when you're doing something that's less efficient. But the more you move transactions inside, you are losing that feedback, and also this enables firms to get more hierarchical. But information doesn't travel that well in hierarchies, because you always want to tell you always want to tell your boss what they want to hear, and so so as the firm grows, the economies and the diseconomies of scale both grow, but the reason that economies of scale work is that the economies of scale initially grow faster than the diseconomies, but they can't go on forever. It can't be the case that the economy growing are always ahead of the diseconomies, because if it were, then all of society being one big firm, or the entire planet being one big firm, would be the most efficient thing, as H.G. Wells thought. But no free market economist is going to think that. And so obviously there comes a time when the diseconomies of scale start overtaking the economies of scale. It may not be the same in every industry, and it can depend on various details, but it does happen. And when that happens in a free market, the firm would have to stop growing or be outcompeted. But if you're not in a free market, then there's the possibility of where the firm that's growing larger can get the state to intervene on its behalf by paying for some of its costs, or getting the taxpayers to pay for some of its costs, or by restricting competitors in various ways, so that they can continue to reap the benefits of the growing economies of scale, while shifting or externalizing the costs of the diseconomies of scale onto someone else. And so that's Kevin's analysis of why we should not expect there to be as many large and hierarchical firms in a free market as there are today.
I think one of the more interesting parts of the argument and thought-provoking parts of the argument is the direct versus indirect subsidies point. I think that often goes kind of unnoticed. Could you maybe just briefly explain what's a direct subsidy versus an indirect subsidy?
Okay, so direct subsidy is that's the most obvious one. The government just gives you. The government says, I favor company A over company B. Here, company A, here you go. So for example, when a local government, or the federal government does this too, but if a local government wants to encourage industry, and so they'll go to some particular business and say, here, we've seized this land by eminent domain for you, and we're going to give you and we're also going to offer you some money to come here and set up so Walmart, as people often think of as like a pure, whether they praise it or criticize it, often think of it as a pure free market thing. But Walmart often, gets gets things through subsidies and through, eminent domain and so on. Um, uh, but that's an obvious case of subsidies. But there are other kinds of subsidies, indirect subsidies, where one thing you could do is if you restrict other businesses more than you restrict that one, then that's a indirect subsidy. And this brings us to sort of the tricky question of selective tax breaks. So suppose that you and I are competing and the government gives me a tax break and doesn't give it to you. Now, a tax break is not the same thing as a subsidy, because it's because the government isn't uh, uh, giving me something; it's taking less from me, and so, in principle, that's good from a libertarian standpoint. But but it can have similar effects. I mean, the analogy I like to give is if if there's some thug in my neighborhood that goes around and breaks everyone's leg but mine, because I don't know, they like me. And I don't think I'm obligated to out of the spirit of equality to ask the thug to break my leg too. But if we now go and have a foot race and I win against all my neighbors, you can't really say that I won through my own athletic prowess, because this guy broke all their legs and didn't break mine, and so there is uh, intervention there. Then let's see another example of
another big one is like infrastructure, right? Government funded infrastructure makes it cheaper to have
so another
big box chains.
Yeah, so Kevin in particular focuses on things like transportation subsidies. So for example, most of the wear and tear on the public highways, the tax funded highways, is done not by individuals tooling around on their Hyundais, but by these the big shipping companies, the big rigs. But they don't pay a proportionate share of the tax, which means that the people who are doing less damage to the highways are subsidizing the people doing more damage to it, and that lowers the cost to firms like Walmart and Amazon and so on, that whose business model relies on long distance shipping. So that's another example of an indirect subsidy.
So I want to throw some objections out there, maybe some lines of thought that I guess I'll start with the idea of are smaller, more numerous, more local firms actually more accountable than larger centralized corporations on some margins? Because a lot of people discuss this increasingly so. Small businesses are kind of notoriously bad on things like wage theft, on maybe HR departments or lack thereof, and those sorts of abuses, maybe skirting best safety practices, those sorts of things, getting better at getting away with those sorts of things. So does the bigness and hierarchy of corporation provide any level of accountability then that actually can't be got from more numerous small firms? I think a lot of people worry about that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, again, the vision that I'm thinking of is not just take the existing economy, delete the large firms, and just leave the small firms as they stand, because
Sure.
the the if the number of small firms increases, then the amount of competition, if it becomes easier for people to start these small firms, they're not restricted, then there'll be more popping up. If there are more popping up, then it is then they have to compete more for workers. And if you have, uh, you know, if you have, you know, problems like wage theft and so forth, uh, that is, you know, the more that that small businesses have to compete for workers, the uh, you know, the harder it will be to treat workers like crap. So it's not that no small businesses as they are now are great. So let's have more of them because they're great now and we want more of those great things. It's that
Right.
having more of them would make them better.
Okay. I want to also give, I guess, maybe kind of a Marxist read of your piece, not because I'm a Marxist, but those disagreements can be actually really illuminating, and I like to think of this discussion. So, wouldn't more local, more numerous, a greater number of firms kind of maybe intensify what you would call, maybe in the negative sense, the anarchy of the market? Like, I think one concern is, this greater market flux. So more flux, more uncertainty, more friction, perhaps, more adjustments. If you have more firms and you have more cycling of firm success, that's more firms going out of business, more people going unemployed, maybe when their business goes out temporarily unemployed. So doesn't centralization offer any kind of security or certainty in this regard? Um, I think the ability for local adjustment is powerful, and that drives a lot of this argument. But when the adjustments can cause people to not be able to put food on the table, then that's the kind of line of argument that a lot of people have, I think, where it looks like centralization can be a lot more attractive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, if you it's a matter of sort of comparing, you know, if you compare the world of small business as it is now, and you just say, well, look at that, and then just remove the power of these big corporations, and then just hold that fixed, and just picture that as fixed, and more of that, then I think that I can see how those worries might be there. But again, I think with more, with more competition, with more small businesses competing, you've got, you've got a way of addressing those questions. Because if more businesses are competing for workers, then that means that you don't have as much of a, uh, you're going to have less unemployment. Um, and unemployment, when you have it, will be briefer because if the new small businesses are vigorously competing for employees. Also, if they have to pay, if in order to get workers, they have to give them higher pay and perhaps more control of the system. It puts people in a position where they, if they can save more, so that unemployment is not as a period of unemployment is not as scary. They can get more in a position to start their own businesses. Um, so I think that a lot of the precarity uh, comes from the fact that the world of small business is insufficiently competitive, and it's insufficiently competitive because it's in the shadow of these big corporations that have gobbled up so much of the market.
Okay, here's another kind of Marxist thought. Uh, all right, freed markets would have more local, more numerous firms. But isn't the corporate state and corporate centralization kind of an inevitable outgrowth of that? The way a lot of Marxists sort of seem to see corporate centralization as a necessary movement along the process from decentralized, antagonistic market society to a centralized, I guess, harmonious communist society. So, we have this history of corporations calling for regulations, barriers to entry, and the like, which you discuss in your piece. But why shouldn't our takeaway from that be that freed markets uh, contain the seeds of their own undoing, in a way? You know, the rivalry of markets seems like there's these built-in incentives for the rivals to capture the state, to grow the state, to create one if it isn't there. And this is sort of dovetails too with the way some people think of Marx as kind of a public choice thinker, and the public choice worries in terms of these incentives to capture the state. So is it kind of inevitable centralization?
I mean, it certainly is true that that competition creates an incentive for people who are not benefiting from that competition to try and stop it. But also creates incentive for the people who are benefiting from competition to try and stop them stopping it. But if we look, at the history of this, uh, these cases where these firms were, you said they either they either capture the state or they create one. But if we look at the history of this, now if we go back to sort of state creation in history, that's very complicated. But we look at it, for example, in 19th century America, people look at the Gilded Age, and people often look at that as a period where a lot of this corporate growth happened, although there was a fair bit before. But the state was already a pretty powerful state, and people think of it as being a small state, and it was compared to ours, but it was a state that already had the power to regulate interstate commerce under the Constitution, for example, and various other things. So there already was a powerful state to capture. So if you have to look at cases where the state just arose, and this was Rousseau's theory of the origin of the state was that you get well, he thought the division of labor created economic centralization, which is I think the opposite of the truth. But he thought that once you get a bunch of rich people, then they will create a state and they will sell it as beneficial to everyone when it's really just beneficial to themselves. If you look at when you talk about the creation of the state, depending on how you define it, it's hard to know what period we're talking about. But the modern nation state, its its origins are complicated, but I'm not sure that it particularly was driven by these sorts of corporate interests. Depending on how you define corporate interest, since in the Middle Ages, everyone was a corporate interest in some sense of corporation, but somewhat different from today. But I think that if you are so if you're talking about cases where there already is a large and powerful state, then certainly there's an incentive for people to capture it. Also, I think we shouldn't just hold as fixed, ordinary people's acquiescence in the process or lack of understanding it. Ideology matters. It's not just a superstructure as the Marxists sometimes think, although Marxists and Marx himself could be more or less nuanced on this depending on the day of the week. But if you can, the people who want a more powerful state will market it as benefiting ordinary people. People who don't want one can market the not having one as benefiting people, and they through education and so forth. And I think that that kind of thing needs to be understood better, because I don't think we could just take people's gullibility as a constant. It's as just a fixed thing that we can't do anything about.
So one thing I really like about this article is it feels like the first half where you discuss a lot of what we've just been discussing, the arguments for corporations versus the market. First half's a lot of this political economy stuff, where the second half is almost like movement sociology of libertarianism. And so I kind of want to dig into that a little more. And so could you explain to our audience what is vulgar libertarianism and vulgar liberalism, which are important in the piece?
Okay, so these are phrases that were coined by
Kevin Carson.
Kevin Carson. And so vulgar libertarianism, as he defines it, is the tendency to treat things that are actually the result of government privilege, to treat them as results of the free market, and therefore to defend them. And vulgar liberalism is just the reverse, to see those it's halfway the same. You see those things as results of the free market, but you then take their badness as reason to critique the free market. And one of the points that Kevin makes is that people, both the vulgar libertarians and the vulgar liberals, will often seem to grant the point that we're trying to make. So the vulgar libertarian and the vulgar liberal will both say, yes, there's a lot of government intervention to prop up corporate power, and that's bad. But then they will often seem to forget it, or not, to think of it as sort of a, maybe they sort of from our standpoint, they would be understating or underestimating the extent of it. And so they'll just see it as like, well, yeah, that's one thing that happens, and that's bad. But they will tend to think that it's not sort of the central feature. And there's a nice piece by Charles Johnson where he talks about the belt versus the bones, whether something is just how deeply ingrained something is in the system. So and we tend to think of this kind of government privilege as deeply and thoroughly embedded in the system, and radically deeply part of what the system is. And for vulgar libertarians and vulgar liberals, I think they often tend to see it as just sort of a sideshow, a thing that happens, and they'll grant that it's genuine and important and bad, but then they'll slide back. So so I think like Ayn Rand and Noam Chomsky might both be good examples on opposite sides of this. So Rand famously called big business a persecuted minority. She has an article called "Big Business: America's Persecuted Minority," where she talks about various kinds of government regulations. And the government regulations she talks about, a lot of them are crappy regulations. They're ways in which the government can sort of selectively pick winners and losers, but to treat that as the main thing that's going on, and treat big business as the main victim of it as on. And in other contexts, she's aware of that. I mean, she talks about the aristocracy of pull, where the power of government enables people with political power and political cronyism to get the government to shut their rivals down and become bigger and wealthier than they could become on the open market. So she's aware of the problem, but then when she seems to forget about it when she's writing about the big business's persecuted minority. And on the other side, you've got Noam Chomsky, who's devoted a lot of his career to showing how corporate power is propped up by various kinds of government interventions. But then he keeps saying, we need, although he's a long run anarchist, he says in the shorter run, we desperately need the government because it's the only check against the power of corporations. So it's a case where sort of you see it, then you don't, and you can question why is it or what's going on. But anyway, it's a dynamic that seems to happen where each side will, and then they'll say, and then when you call them on it, they'll say, well, look, we've granted your point. We've granted that. You talk like we don't think that that cronyism exists or that it's bad. Well, we've granted that it exists. We've granted it's bad. So you're not bringing us any news. But then, having said that, they go on then either to attack or defend various features of the existing economy, as though they were features of a free market, as though they had forgotten their own analyses that at least to our minds would seem to show that that they should be much more skeptical about the view that this is is a product of a pure free market.
Yeah, there's also a great piece on C4SS by Alex Aragona called "Imagining State Capitalism" that talks just about this and how are you imagining sort of pockets of governmental intervention in what's otherwise a free market, or are you imagining pockets of free market activity in what's otherwise government controlled? And you said earlier too, the confusion reinforces the system itself, but the confusion sort of reinforces each other's confusion as well, like in terms of rhetorically in this polarizing way. And that's sort of a huge, I think, important note on this piece that is trying to dispel.
Yeah, because it's so when so if you are what Kevin could call a vulgar liberal, and the terms I've used are left conflationist and right conflationist. Whether you both conflate free markets with the existing corporate dominated system, but the right winger conflates them and says, okay, that's so much the worse for so much the better for the the corporate plutocracy, and the left winger says so much the worse for the free markets. But as a result, then people who are favor free markets, when they when they are led by this conflation to defend
by an invisible hand,
sometimes, and there are
and incantations.
There are malign invisible hand mechanisms.
We'll get to that essay.
When they're to do that, then they will confirm the suspicion of people on the right that their left-wing opponents are just opposed to freedom, because they're not just attacking the cronyism, they're attacking the free market stuff. And likewise, when right-wingers defend the aspects of the existing economy that, from our analysis, are not the result of a free market, but which they take to be the result of a free market, and therefore they take to be the result of people's voluntary choices, then the left wingers will feel confirmed in thinking that defenders of free markets are really just corporate shills, and so each side is led therefore to take less seriously the genuine concerns and values of the other.
They're merely aesthetic.
It becomes harder for libertarians to see or sympathize with the with the concerns of the left about corporate power. It becomes harder for people on the left to see or sympathize with the concerns of right libertarians about free markets versus government intervention. And so again, to borrow a phrase from Rand, you're offering poison as food and poison as antidote, and you shift back and forward, and it becomes harder for people to see their way to a third possibility, which is what I'm trying to put forward.
Well, my next question is kind of about that third possibility, left libertarianism. Is there vulgar left libertarianism? What I have in mind by that is underrating the extent to which elements of the status quo are a result of free market forces. So, for instance, thinking like all profit, interest, and rent would disappear in a free market, as some left libertarians believe that some others don't. So, isn't that like the error in the other direction? And couldn't we call that vulgar left libertarianism?
It certainly seems to be that, yes, that is a
Okay.
a possible danger. And of course, I'm not as confident as some left libertarians are that profit, rent, and interest will all vanish, or that there wouldn't be any quite large businesses. So certainly people can just as you can understate the extent to which existing features of the market are the result of government privilege, so you can overstate it. And of course, I think that any left libertarians who are overstating it are other left libertarians, not me. But of course, I could be wrong.
Yeah. You note in the piece it's a spectrum. It really should be it can't be too dichotomous. I mean, there is like a spectrum of views here in terms of to what extent you're seeing parts of the system baked into it by a free market or the government. Another interesting wrinkle that I wanted to bring up, and this has become more common since that pandemic thing that happened, and that is
I missed. What was that?
Oh, don't worry about it. It's no big deal. So paleo libertarians, I guess, using what sound historically like left libertarian arguments against what they perceive to be vulgar libertarianism. I have something in mind like thinking that there would be like no vaccines, or like in a free market, or just without the governmental support of vaccines, they would be like there'd be way less common, way more expensive. People would take way less of them. And you have other cases of this to where, there is this huge partnership between the state and the medical industry and everything. And so they have a right, there's obviously important truths there. But it's interesting to me how it seems like a lot of people who are otherwise very right libertarian and have dismissed these arguments are kind of bringing them out in the last few years to argue against a lot of responses to the pandemic. Have you noticed that, or what do you think about that?
And a lot of right libertarians who had been, defending big pharma, even ones who were sort of anti-patent, had been defending it, and then the pandemic comes along, and suddenly suddenly big pharma is the enemy. So this is the idea that there'd be fewer vaccines, that they'd be more expensive. That looks like a feature from their point of view. It might look like a bug from other people's point of view. But again, I think there's reason to doubt both sides, because and a lot of people, let's say the people who are not anti-vaccine, and a lot of people who are skeptical of patents in general, a lot of them think that there's a reasonable exception for big pharma because the research costs involved are so high that they're not going to be motivated to produce this unless they get some kind of government help. But it's worth remembering that that it's partly patents that make the research so high. Now, I'm not claiming that it's solely that, but new drugs rely on earlier drugs. New research and development relies on earlier research and development. And when that earlier research and development is protected by patent, then you've got to pay those guys off in order to produce your thing. And often, corporations will find themselves having to just buy off ahead of time a whole bunch of different patents in the expectation that some of those might be relevant to what they're doing. And so and also, of course, some of the high prices are part of a kind of a price discrimination scheme, which is that because a lot of firms will produce very high, will produce drugs and then sell them at like way over cost. But if to people whose insurance companies won't reimburse that, won't cover it, then they have programs where they'll provide them at lower cost to those people, which is fine. But it just shows that it shows that the actual costs are not quite as much as they say, because they actually are able to offer these things more cheaply, often at zero or close to zero to people. And there have been I've seen I can't speak to this much in detail because I'm not an expert on it, but I have seen people say that Italy for a long time, the pharmaceutical industry had little or no patent protection, and they did all right. Now, I have not researched that, so I don't know what exactly the laws were or how all right they did. But anyway, that is a claim that people have made.
Uh, I want to play a game, and
I've
that
bored you with this interview. I see. All right, go off and play your game.
and that is the vulgar libertarianism game. So the rules are there's a scale of 1 to 10. So treat 10 as the utmost vulgar, uh, the utmost conflationist, and uh, or because I'm trying to account for this new category of vulgar left libertarianism. So let 10 be the
Sure, you know
utmost.
I'm an Austrian. I mean, we only use ordinal rank, not not
Yeah.
cardinal quantities. But
So 10 is the utmost vulgar right libertarian, and 1 is the utmost vulgar left libertarian. So erring in each direction, with 5 being like the golden mean, like the right exact amount of conflationism. Like you're totally right in terms of what parts of the existing status quo you think are a product of the free market. So 1 is the utmost vulgar left, and 10 is the utmost vulgar right, and 5 is the optimal. So I'm just going to run down the list of libertarians and tell me what number you think. Does that make sense?
yeah, okay. Although I will say by way of caution that I prefer to use vulgar libertarian and as an adjective for views rather than for people, since people are a complicated
No, I know.
mix.
So just the views
Also
of these
because I'm so polite, but
just the views of these people then on this
okay.
on this spectrum.
All right.
All right, so let's start with Ayn Rand.
Um, again, if you're uh it
She's
would
got to be
have to get
high.
yes, it's I mean again, it's going to have to be an average when and it can't average ordinal rankings, but I'll play along. So if you it would be like a 10 if you go by some of her writings. Um, Others of her writings it would be more like a uh, um, 6 maybe. So take the average like maybe an 8.
Okay, Mises.
Um, maybe around the same score for him.
Yeah.
I mean, um, he's got his book, The Anti-Capitalist Mentality, is even worse than Rand. um, uh, um, and of course,
So like,
He did write Rand, saying, the great thing about Atlas Shrugged is that it showed people that that they were inferior to the entrepreneurs.
well, is that exactly? I don't know if that's a. I mean, I remember what you're talking about, but
Yeah, that's
that's an exact quote.
that's not quite the same thing. But anyway,
It's like an 8 or 9, maybe 8 on
something.
a
I'll
good
say
day.
8. I'll say 8.
Okay, Murray Rothbard.
Oh,
It's tougher.
that's tricky. During during the 60s, uh, I would say fairly far to the left. Maybe not as far to the left as CFRSS folks, but uh, reasonably far. I mean, thinking past the middle. Oh wait, no. Past the left is. I
Yeah,
forgot. Forgetting that one isn't good. It's conflation the other direction. So
right.
um,
So he's closer to 5.
pretty close to
Very
5,
close,
and
probably pretty close to 5 around that point.
yeah, uh in his later writings, he stresses that stuff less, but uh he doesn't take up the opposite position that much. It becomes his when he has his right wing turn later on, it's not primarily about that stuff. It's more the cultural stuff.
And if
Uh,
anything, it's repurposed in the more paleo, almost a horseshoe style, objection to corporate capitalism that you do see sometimes on the right.
mhm. So Rothbard is Rothbard's not too bad. I guess here's one point that might make him, maybe more of a 6 than a 5. is, he explicitly gives an argument for being suspicious of corporate bigness. In fact, this is an argument that Peter Klein has quoted and endorsed, but it's not a reason to. But he doesn't take it as a reason to think that there wouldn't be as many large corporations in a free market. He just takes as a reason to think there'd be different ones. He thinks that if you are a large corporation under the existing system, then you probably got that way through government privilege. Rothbard says, but he's not saying bigness itself is reason to suspect um, uh, government privilege. It's bigness against the background of state intervention that gives you reason to suspect it. So maybe that's a 6, not a 5.
Milton Friedman.
Yeah, he's someone. He's someone who is both good and bad on this, because well, I guess like everyone I've mentioned is, but there are passages where he sounds as though sort of very down the line, sort of right vulgar libertarian, but also he there are passages where perhaps more than a lot of other free market thinkers, he says, because this is always looking out for for subsidies and favors and from the government.
Yeah, he has that quote: the biggest enemy of capitalism is capitalists. He basically says. So he has his moments.
Yeah. So
or capitalism in the sense of free markets, I should say,
yes.
in that quote, of course.
Yeah. Although I think that his
again, yes,
his vision of capitalism would probably look less would so sort of a similar issue as with Rothbard. He's aware he's aware of the very much aware of the problem. His vision of how things would be without the problem probably looks more like the present system than we think it would. So maybe in the same ballpark as
7.
Yeah, they're they might not be happy sharing a slot, but somewhere in that.
What about David Friedman?
David Friedman is someone who's explicitly changed his view over time on this. So in the first edition of Machinery of Freedom, he mentions his fondness for agoric ways of doing it, which he although he attributes to Robert Lefebvre instead of Samuel Konkin, but the idea of we take us too far afield to go into what agoric is, but he's very suspicious of the worker boss structure and more in favor of having worker controlled and private proprietorships and so forth, and not having the traditional worker boss structure, so that would and he also not just that he's in favor of that, but he thinks that would be more likely under in a free market. So maybe in the first edition of Machinery of Freedom, maybe a 5. Later on, he became convinced. He's written about this and also talked to me about this. He became convinced that more managerial, more hierarchical firms have an efficiency advantage, and so that a free market would look more like today's market than he'd previously thought. And so in the at the third edition of Machinery of Freedom, he got rid of that section. So but I don't know he's gone into that much detail as to exactly what he envisions instead. So I don't know whether, I don't know how you position him relative to Milton Friedman. whether he'd be, to north or south of him, or left or right of him, or so to speak. Because I know what he rejected, but I don't know exactly what his vision is or what he accepts. But and also he's very undoctrinaire in the sense of of precisely what kind uh, of legal regimes and economic regimes that you could have. He thinks that there's a wide variety of ones that could work, and he's thinks we should be sort of empirically humble about what would work, apart from some very broad things. So maybe I'll just, for the sake of, I'll put him in the same slot as his father, just because I don't have good evidence to the contrary. So maybe like around 7.
What about like Hayek? Do you think he's any different than Mises or Friedman on this? Or about the same?
It's not something that he talks about as much.
And he also expresses reservations over the term capitalism at one point.
Yeah,
he doesn't seem to like it that much. Maybe a little better.
He he has on the other hand, he has hostility to the concept of social justice. I think it's excessive and confused,
and like the usefulness of economic inequality too is an argument he makes.
Yeah,
so that's another one.
But also I can't imagine him writing to Rand saying, "You have correctly shown that people are inferior to the entrepreneurs."
Are you saying that's an exact? I don't.
Yeah, yes.
I thought it was like people are more dependent than they realize on.
No, the letter that Mises wrote to Rand says, the correct message you have shown them is that you are inferior. Let's see if I can find it.
No.
Letter Mises.
We'll have to have Mises on next week to defend this.
Atlas. Here we go. You have the courage to tell the masses what no politician told them. You are inferior, and all the improvements in your conditions, which you simply take for granted, you owe to the effort of men who are better than you.
Okay, you're right. I was inferior in this context.
And so I think that I think he's actually reading. I think he's actually reading Atlas Shrugged as worse. That was his comment on Atlas Shrugged. I think he's actually reading as worse than it is, because I think that Atlas Shrugged is torn between two visions of the conflict between, heroic capitalists and scummy workers, which is one way she sometimes sees seeing it or framing it, and heroic productive people in every economic class versus parasitic people in every economic class. And because most of the businessmen in Atlas Shrugged are parasitic buffoons.
Yeah. And John Galt was a worker.
There's also a titled aristocrat in the story. It's complicated.
Let's move on. Benjamin Tucker.
Well, since given that I see more of a role for rent and interest and so forth than he did. Well, the problem is that you don't really have on your scale, on your spectrum, you don't really have a position for like vulgar libertarian, for the vulgar left libertarian.
1 through 5.
Oh, I thought that was I thought that was vulgar liberal.
No,
okay.
It's just a list of libertarians, and so one would be you're assuming virtually everything is the product not of the free market at all. Profit, rent, interest, everything.
Okay. Well, all right. I misunderstood half of your spectrum, but since I haven't placed there yet that hasn't affected anything.
Yeah, he's the first one who
All right, so
assumed.
yeah, so I guess he would be he would be somewhere to the left, but um uh although there are times when he can, when he's being curmudgeonly, he actually sounds a bit farther to the right.
Yeah,
Uh but
yeah,
but yeah, so to the left, but not like insanely, insanely so. Uh
at least a
Especially,
four.
yeah, four. Four is good. The big four.
What about Spooner, Lysander Spooner? Also around there? Because
Um,
they have some disagreements.
they do have some disagreements. Spooner has no problem with rent or interest or profit. He also has no problem with intellectual property. Um, so I guess he's more capitalist friendly than Tucker is. But on the other hand, he's pretty definitely uh yeah. So I guess for both good and bad reasons, I want to put him to the right of Tucker, but
He's
still, yeah,
five, but not for just for
yeah.
having
He
being
might have to be
wrong
five. He
in
might
each
be five on
direction.
average.
Yeah, on
Yeah.
average, but not because. Okay, here's a spicy one. Kevin Carson.
Um. You know, well, Kevin Carson at the time he wrote Mutual's Political Economy, or Kevin Carson now, because he's well, I don't know if he changed his view particularly on this, but he was you know he was more of a market guy than he is now. Although I wouldn't say he's anti-market now, but he thinks that
Yeah,
he sees the markets has always been part of the mix, but he puts less emphasis on them now compared to other things.
yeah. He stresses the more adjectivelessness
Uh,
aspect now.
but but again, I'm not sure how much that affects this issue. I mean, uh, you know, I mean, his views on these things are very close to Tucker's. His views on
Yeah,
they're different in detail, but they're uh, on the other hand, when he gets curmudgeonly, he doesn't move right. Uh,
I have no idea what you're talking about.
pardon.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
So if uh,
So what you're saying is like -10.
maybe somewhere in the vicinity of Tucker.
What about Carl Hess?
Well, and there was, Carl Hess went through various different phases. There were times when he, uh, so he, there's Carl Hess, the speechwriter for Goldwater. Then there's Carl Hess who went, who, uh, sort of, you know, flirted with anarcho-communism, and then he went back to calling himself a capitalist. So I don't know if I'm taking the average of him over time or what.
Yeah, he
Or
particularly
particularly,
poses a problem. We'll just
yeah,
leave.
and he focuses so when he tends he tends to make either very broad, vague theoretical statements or focus on very concrete, practical details like community
Oh,
technology and so forth.
yeah, that's
The
interesting.
theoretical level in between,
Hmm.
he doesn't have as much to say about. I mean, and one time he embraced the labor theory value, although I'm not sure what flavor of it he embraced. Later on, he repudiated it, although I'm not sure on exactly what grounds he repudiated it. So, so it's harder to pin him down on the sort of the theoretical level as opposed to either very practical hands-on stuff like, here's how I organized my neighborhood in Adams, Morgan, versus very broad stuff like, uh, power in more hands instead of fewer.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, and I like him in both those modes, but I don't think he's not as much of a theorist as any of
Sure.
the other talked about, I think.
What about Hoppe of the Hans variety?
Hoppe I assume that was the Hoppe you had in mind, not Edward Hopper, the painter.
Well, he was next.
I mean, Hoppe, although, his deviations from goodness tend to be in a very right-wing direction. On this particular issue, he it was a little bit complicated. So so he has an article, Marxist and Austrian class analysis, where he says he lays out the essence of Marxist class analysis. He says, actually, this is essentially right, except that Marx has got some of the mechanism wrong. He doesn't see how much this depends on state privilege, and he's got the solution wrong because communism sucks. But he's roughly right that there is an elite ruling class that is a result of privilege, and he's roughly right even about who they are.
At times.
On the other hand, pardon?
At times, I guess sometimes he seems to take a very right wing line of thought and talk about how privileged actually underprivileged people are because of
he does that too. And also he has this view that one of the reasons that one of the things he likes about monarchy, although he thinks it's not as good as free market anarchy, one of the things he likes about monarchy is that a monarch is like the private owner of the entire country, and that when you are the private owner of an entire country, then you tend to make want to conserve resources, not be wasteful, and so on. And so that's a kind of favoritism of sort of, I mean, that is basically saying having the whole economy being one big firm wouldn't be so bad. I mean, it's not his ideal, but he does have a certain nostalgic fondness for monarchies, not sort of the kind of monarchies that mostly exist, for example, in Europe today, which are pretty much ceremonial, but like real monarch with real power. And it seems bizarre to me because if you want to look at a case of a monarch who really was the private owner of an entire country, I think the King of Belgium owning the Congo is a good example, and it's not an attractive model, I think.
Not great.
But anyway, so he's so he's got so he says some things that are pretty close to the center, and then he says some things that are like way over on the right side, and that's actually a good description of him on a lot of issues. And they're and there, I think that there's over time a slide more and more, whether it's a change of views or just sort of being more open about the less palatable stuff as it becomes, as he finds it context where it's easier for him to get away with saying it. I don't know, but he would be, I think that that Marxist piece was sort of very, very much under during the period he was more under the influence of Rothbard. I think that I'd be more surprised. I'm not sure he would repudiate it necessarily. I'd say, I'd still think that. But that would be much less his focus. So I think, and overall, and his he doesn't seem to have a lot of concern with big corporations also, and he wants these big privately owned neighborhoods that can regulate the makeup of their inhabitants and kick out the gays and so forth. And so that's a kind of of maybe local centralization, but it's certainly, I mean, traditionally one of the attractions of free market anarchism was supposed to be different different legal regimes competing in the same geographical territory, so that you could switch from one to the other without having to move to a new location, just as you can change your cell phone provider without having to move. And so his vision of these enclaves, it's a more centralist vision than most free market anarchists have had. So, yeah, he's somewhere on average. He's somewhere fairly far right. Although there's some things that they pull him back to the left, but still, he's. Uh, but it's not exactly sort of the traditional corporate elite that he favors,
Yeah,
but
hard to place on this axis
yeah, I don't know.
in particular.
Yeah, something's clearly wrong, but it's hard to describe in terms
Yeah,
of spectrum.
it's not just right libertarian on one end, left libertarian. It's specifically the versions of conflationism that they fall prey to. I have a couple more I'm curious about.
Sure.
Don Lavoie.
I'm not sure I know the full extent of some of his views to know precisely on this issue of uh of what you expect corporations to look like. I mean his he has sort of a very de-hierarchicalized view of society in general, and he thinks that you'd get more of that in the free market. But on this specific issue, I don't know how much he wrote about it, or whether he wrote about stuff that I haven't read. Do
What
you know
about?
of any?
Well, no, he was. From what I've read, it doesn't get into it too much. He does have a passage or two in National Economic Planning that gives the standard brief argument for why some hierarchy in firms would be expected, and why completely work-owned firms maybe wouldn't be as good or efficient.
Mhm.
My next one is Steve Horowitz. So he was both part of the discussion, and I think probably has similar views to Don. What would you rank Steve?
Yeah, I mean uh, and he would at least terminologically he would shift back and forth. There were times when he'd call himself an anti-capitalist, and other times when he'd be embracing the term capitalism again. I'm not sure to what extent um, he was, to what extent those were differences of changes of mind about the views as opposed to changes of the mind about the rhetoric. But
Right.
uh, because I mean, uh, I'd say certainly, definitely to the left of, certainly to the left of Rand and Mises.
Yeah.
Um, was he to the left of the Friedmans? He's certainly to the right of the Middle. Maybe somewhere. Sometimes he's talked a little bit. Might be to the left of the Friedmans. Other times he talked like he might be sort of right about there.
Yeah.
So right about uh 6 or 7.
Yeah. I was saying like 6.5. Like he's comes really close, really broad agreement, but then you're not giving Walmart enough credit, maybe those kinds of arguments. So I feel like that lands him there. What about William Gillis? It's kind of a weird one.
That is interesting because if I try to compare, like for example, like what he and Kevin disagree about, it's really hard to map it straightforwardly onto this spectrum.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like that is relevant.
I mean, he was um, hmm, because in some ways he is there's some ways in which he is closer economically to traditional free market libertarianism than Kevin is.
Yeah.
And he's, he certainly is, more open to, he's more open to certain phenomena like rent and interest and so forth. He's not, he's not as hostile to Uber as Kevin is, although I'm not sure whether they actually disagree on any substantive point there about what's good and what's bad about Uber. What's good about ride sharing services breaking taxi monopolies? What's bad about ways in which Uber benefits from government privilege? I'm not sure there would be any substantive disagreement. It's just a matter of what strikes them as salient about the situation. On the other hand, it sounds odd to say that William is more moderate in his leftism, or is more or that he's more right wing than that doesn't seem right too. So maybe on average it's just about being roughly the same as Kevin, because these are averages of cardinal quantities that I've.
Oh, sure. All right, last one. Roderick Long.
Well, I mean, obviously, I think my own views are correct.
So you're the only 5.
I'm going to think I'm a 5. Well, I think some other people are
ego.
5 today, although they may have ended up there on averages. But I think that
you're at 5 for the right combination.
Tucker, Scooter, Kevin, and William all roughly in a 5-ish area. Although no, I guess
like a 4 for Tucker.
Did I put Kevin and Tucker in a 4 because I'm not as
harsh on profit and rent and interest.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, but anyway, I mean, sort of by definition, I think that my views are correct. And if my views were to change, I think those views were correct.
Saying your views are correct.
All right. Let me ask you, where would you put yourself?
It depends on the year or the day. One day I could be 50, negative 50. Who knows? I mean, I'm unpredictable in that way. So just closing thoughts. To go back to your piece, that was a fairly enjoyable game, by the way. But to end back on your article,
did I win prizes?
Yeah, you won continuing this podcast for 5 more minutes. You end the article on kind of an optimistic note about left libertarianism. This article was written 16 years ago. What do you think now about that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. And this actually came up recently on Facebook about a different piece of mine that an even earlier piece of mine that someone was quoting, where I said, we're now moving into sort of a more lefty version of libertarianism is now coming more to the front, and someone was saying, well, that turned out to be wrong. We've got this slide in the libertarian movement to the right lately. It's hard to say whether it's right or wrong, because I think both are growing. I think that on the one hand, the overall libertarian movement has slid to the right, both on a lot of these corporate issues, except where, sort of weird paleo concerns put them the other way, and on the cultural issues. But I think that the number of people who take the this left libertarian position are growing too. So, as I said, the tares and the wheat grew up together. Now, in terms of which has a greater market share of libertarianism, obviously it's the more right wing approach. But we're certainly, I think we're certainly more visible than we used to be, and I think there are more of us. But of course, it's like the ant saying to the elephant, "Hey, elephants! Look, there are there are a lot more of us ants than there were earlier as the elephants go thundering by. And I think
And we
so.
wouldn't want too much market share anyway because of the diseconomies of scale, I assume. So I'm satisfied with. I think the last I like asking you, what would you change, if anything, about the piece? If you wrote it today, last time you said you would have made the article on the 10 objections to anarchism more left libertarian in a lot of ways. This article is, which makes it a fun follow up. But would you? Is there anything would you be change your mind on anything in this one? Or are you stuck in your views like a curmudgeon?
I may be fairly stuck. I'm not sure there's that much I would change. I mean, I would.
Would you make it meaner or more hostile to your opponents at all? That could have helped, perhaps.
Probably not.
Okay. Okay.
But yeah, I'm sure there are detailed things I would change, but I don't think that I would change things too radically.
All right. Well, this piece stands the test of time 16 years later. Well, thanks. This has been a very fun episode. Thanks for your time as always, Roderick. Everyone join us next month for another episode and another writing to explore in the very vast, long library. Take care, everyone. Thanks, Roderick.
Thank you.